if we have a diverse identity and we don't attach our self-worth and our entire sense of self to one thing, being a surgeon, being a doctor, whatever it is, then we have the freedom to pivot.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. I have my soul sister with us today. We have Dr. Mel Thacker. She is an ENT surgeon, a physician coach, a podcaster, a TEDx speaker. I just re-listened to your TEDx, by the way. I freaking love it. All about listening to our patients and what can happen when we don't. So I will for sure share that link down below. But before we go deep dive into our discussion today, Mel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I am super stoked to have you here too. And I mentioned to you, and I know I follow you on social media. I'm like, we could talk about so many things. And today, for the many people here who are considering big career changes and they are feeling trapped in the system or lost because who am I if I even contemplate a shift, especially as physicians and other people who create their identities in their career. I would love to focus on that topic of your recent shift out of surgery and focusing more on coaching and also a little bit more about your story. So where would you
Yeah,
like to start with that?
I guess I'll start from the beginning. I'll say how I kind of got into surgery and then how I decided to leave it.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Um, yeah, I decided when I was 13 I was going to be a doctor. I just was like committed. I had no plan B, and I was like, that's what I'm doing. And then at the age of 16, I watched my own hand surgery. I had a snowboarding incident. I had never snowboarded before, but I went with a couple of friends and I just went flying down a hill and ran right into a fence, hand first,
Oh,
and had a dislocated fracture. And because I had eaten that morning, I had a little chocolate before I went to the ER and they had to operate right away. They're like, oh, we're going to do this under an axillary block. So I got to watch the whole thing and I was like, oh my God, that's awesome. I'm going to do that. And so I thought I was going to go into orthopedics, but when I was rotating through, actually as a college student, when I shadowed some orthopedic surgeons, I was like, this is a lot of old people who break their hips. Like, this doesn't sound fun at all. And so I decided against it.
yeah.
And then in medical school, we watched this movie called The Doctor. It's, I think, from the 70s.
Okay.
I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it or if you've ever heard of it, Jillian.
I'm having a picture. Can you share what exactly it's about?
So it's like an asshole surgeon. Can I swear?
Yeah, of
Okay.
course.
An asshole
Authentic.
surgeon.
Anything that comes out authentic, here we are. Okay.
Yay. So he's like one of those people who treats all patients as diagnoses, and he's like pimping all the residents, and he's just a jerk, and he's got a big ego. He's like the quintessential like white guy, old dude surgeon. And then he ends up with a head and neck cancer. And so he has to see this woman ENT doctor, and she's like shoving her fingers down his throat, and she's got her headlight, and like she's just kind of like getting to down to business. And then the whole, I think, moral of the story is like he becomes a patient and then he realizes what it's like to be a patient and then he changes his tune and then he becomes a better doctor. Um, but as soon as I saw that, it was almost like something clicked and I was like, oh, I want to do that. So then I decided to go into ENT and I really fit in with the people. And I was like, yeah, these are my people.
Mhm.
So that's what I did. And I finished residency in 2012. I did a fellowship and finished that in 2013 in rhinology. And then I did 2 years in academics and I was like, oh my God, I hate this because
Mm.
I realized that I valued autonomy
Yeah.
immensely and
Hmm.
I couldn't understand the bureaucracy.
Hmm.
I had about a million secretaries. I didn't know who did what. I didn't have any control. If I wanted to change a clinic or cancel a clinic, I had to give 30 days notice
Hmm.
in advance. Somebody else like basically decided everything for me.
I'm having my heart because I literally
Yeah.
just before we signed on, I was talking about how controlling and oppressive and how much agency you lose in academia. I'm feeling it for you right now. Okay, please continue.
Yeah. So I had a 2 year contract and I was like, get me out of here.
Mm.
And my husband and I, we had just given birth to our first child and we were like, we don't want to live here. Meanwhile, New England is like such a beautiful place. It's the place where I met my husband. It's where his family's from. And my in-laws are two of the most incredible human beings you'll ever meet. Their names are Bones and Taps. And I was like, I want my kids to be near Bones and Taps. So they live like a mile down the road. So it was a very easy decision. I was like, I got to get out of academia. I can't live in Jacksonville, Florida. And we're going to have a second baby. We got to be near your parents. And
Can
my
you
husband's like,
share
yes.
can you share more about what makes Bones and Taps such a great family unit for you?
I will give you a story just to illustrate what Bones is like. I think
Okay.
Bones is a coach before anybody knew what coaching is. She's
Hmm.
just always operated from
Okay.
that mindset. And here's a good example. So she's at her daughter's and they have an animal and she's allergic to this animal. And so her eyes start swelling. And and she's like, "Oh, it's okay. I was going to go to sleep anyway." Like she's one of those like perpetual creative response to anything that comes up. Like
Yeah.
she doesn't make anything mean anything. She's always in service. She's always giving and focusing on like her children and her friends and people just flock to her. She's just like this amazing life force. And then my father-in-law Taps is just an icon in the community. He's like a big fish in a little pond because he's like really well known in this small town of Ashland.
Mhm.
But he's a lawyer and he's hilarious and smart and fun and they're just like a dynamic duo and they're unique humans that you'll
Mhm.
never encounter ever again.
Mm.
And so I
That's
wanted my
really
kids to
funny.
be near them and get their wisdom.
Yeah, I think it's funny, and humor is so interesting right now because I'm learning a lot about how humor supports us when we are undergoing significant trauma. And of course, there's a time and a place for it where humor can land wrong and humor can land in a healing way. But my mom is really funny, and I realized how helpful that is at this stage in my life, that she is super funny. So I was picturing my mom hanging out with these two people you just said because I think she would probably fit right in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So like to illustrate what Taps is like, and I'm sure your mom and Taps would get along just famously,
Yeah.
but this is how he babysits. Like he basically falls asleep with like the a paper on his lap. Like he'll be sitting on our porch. So if he babysits, it's like, oh, our kids are actually babysitting him. He's really
That's
not going to do anything.
hilarious. Yeah.
But he comes up with this song where he's like, I'm as happy as I can be because Taps is taking good care of me. And like that's his little jingle and it's like, yeah, Taps. And we're always like telling the kids like make sure that Taps behaves himself. So if he's going to babysit, it's basically my kids kind of, taking the reins, which
Where
is
did
really cute.
it is really cute. And where did their nicknames come from?
Taps has always been Taps. We don't know where it came from. His name's Robert.
Okay.
But my kids don't know. They're like, this is my Taps. Like everyone
Yeah.
calls him Taps, his friends, the kids.
Oh, interesting.
Bones is her name's Arlene. They call her Gammy, but it came from being really skinny as a young girl. And then my husband just always called his mom Bones. And he was like, it was so easy in a crowd. Like I wouldn't yell like mom, I would yell Bones, and then she would turn around.
Fascinating. Yeah, I was curious because my mom, her nickname by one of her cousins was Traff. And the reason why she got it is because they weren't allowed to say fart. So it's fart spelled backwards.
It's so cute.
Okay, so I totally did what I always do, and I veered us a little off, but it was so great to hear that story.
Yeah.
But it was helpful in your decision. So you decided to move from Florida to the Northeast, it sounds like,
Yep.
closer to home, and get out of academia, which was feeling like it was just not the right fit for you at the time.
Yep. Yeah. It just wasn't the right fit. And so I got into private practice and it was awesome. And then I became a partner and I love the community, Worcester, Massachusetts. Love the mix of patients. I mean, there's some riffraff, so to speak, and professors and students and everyday people. It's just a really awesome mix of humans. And I connected with so many patients and I developed really close relationships with my patients. And I loved it. But then as time went by, it was like I made a lot of money for my partners and then I made a lot of money in my practice. And on paper, you could say like I'm successful, like I'm killing it. But I started to learn how the sausage is made.
Mhm.
And as soon as I got like a peek behind the curtain, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz or something. You're like seeing like, oh, like this isn't what I thought it was at all.
Mhm.
And I recognized that the people who are in power really don't put the physician-patient relationship. They don't put it at the center of healthcare. And that's the way I've always approached healthcare. Like our relationship is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognized that that was slowly being taken away. I couldn't keep that as like my main priority because the people who pulled the strings didn't put that as their priority. They put profits as their priority.
Mm-hmm.
And so moral injury started to creep in.
Yeah.
And then just last year, I decided to leave, and my reasons were threefold. One, because of moral injury, and I can give you many examples of that.
Mhm.
Two, and feeling undervalued as well.
Yeah.
Second reason is because of unsafe practices of the for-profit hospital that I was covering. I just thought somebody was going to get hurt, and I wasn't willing to be there when it happened and be responsible
Mhm.
or play any part in that. And then the third reason was personal growth, because as I learned all this coaching stuff, I was like, my brain is like working on content and creating podcasts and trying to help my clients. And so I would sit with a patient and my brain wasn't fully on their problem and I didn't think it was fair to them.
Mhm.
And so it was just time to leave. And so I was like, I gotta go. But it's fascinating because I keep saying like I went out like Seinfeld because I've never been more efficient. I've never been more connected. Like even when I catch my brain being distracted, I can get back with my patient and give them presence. I've never been better connected with my patients. I've never been a better surgeon. I've never been more successful. I've never had a better reputation, but I'm like, I have to leave.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. You said that. We just, in a book club, read the book Quit by Annie Duke, I think. And you just highlighted you left at a very challenging place because you were on paper at the top of your game. And that moral injury, if you would have had stayed, may you share the impact and what moral injury looked like? Because I do think people are confusing burnout or not knowing what to call what is moral injury.
Yeah, it is confusing. Moral injury is basically wanting to do something for your patient, wanting to give the best care to your patient and having a plan, like treatment or a surgery, and then some other entity forcing you not to be able to do that, or just not having the materials to do that. Like the perfect example of moral injury is like the surgeons who at, I think it was St. Elizabeth's Hospital, one of the Steward hospitals in Massachusetts. It was a postpartum woman who was bleeding and they took her to the operating room and she ended up dying because they didn't have a liver coil. They needed something to cauterize something. I don't know. I'm not general surgery,
Yeah.
but those surgeons, that would be an example of moral injury. They didn't have what they needed. A very smaller version of that, while that was kind of like circling around in my brain, I had a child come in and we don't have pediatric support at the hospital I covered. And they didn't have some pediatric equipment. And so I'm trying to take care of a post-op tonsil bleed and we don't have everything I need. And obviously we're able to like get creative and fix it and everything went fine. But that was one inkling to me, like one piece of information where I was like, ooh, I can see where this can get really scary and dangerous because the hospital decided to get rid of the pediatric department in I think 2015, 2016 because it wasn't bringing in money. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and they refused to bring it back. So had they had a pediatric supported hospital, we wouldn't be in that situation. Pediatrics would be, you know, it would be baked into the hospital. So you wouldn't have these situations where you don't have pediatric equipment. So that's another example of moral injury. And then like even smaller examples, one of the last surgeries I did, they didn't have the equipment I normally use. I use this like, and this is just like tiny little nuanced stuff. I use something called nasopore and I put that in the sinuses when I finish and I have like a very specific protocol that I use and I've used for the last decade. They only had a small amount of that material. And then they had this other type of material that I considered substandard. I've used it before and it doesn't work as well. And I had 6 patients. And so I had 5 that could have the one I usually use, the better, what I think is the better one. And then I had one that had to have the substandard. And it was like, okay, who
Mm-hmm.
gets the crappy like
Mm-hmm.
packing material? And it's
Yeah.
like those are little decisions of moral injury where you're like, how do I decide? How do I
Mm-hmm.
decide which patient gets the material that in my hands, what I have seen in my experience, causes more sinus infections post-op? So I'm basically saying like, you're the one who gets the post-op sinus infection, or is that more at risk for a post-op sinus infection?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't say anything. It's just like these tiny little behind the scenes decisions. that started to add up.
Yeah. And what I was hearing too is like the moral injury coming from both being put into a position where what you do is going against kind of your moral standards, but then also the things that you can't do is going against the moral standards, meaning like the interventions you can't provide are feeling like it's not in alignment with what you value. And then the interventions that you're pushed to provide are also not in alignment. Because I know a lot of the definitions will say it's either what we do or what we can't do
Right.
doesn't align with kind of our moral values.
Yeah, like patients, during COVID who came in, you had to decide who gets the ventilator, right? Because there's only so many ventilators. That's another example of it. I didn't live that. I didn't experience that. Mine is like a much smaller version. But it still matters.
Mhm.
It's not, maybe it's not life or death, but it still matters. And even as small as in September of 2023, when I had a patient who clearly met criteria for surgery, and I called United Healthcare because they didn't approve her surgery. And I talked to the medical director there, who's ENT. And I was like, oh, good. I'm so glad I have an ENT doctor. He'll understand. And he was like, no, she can't have surgery. She doesn't meet criteria. She needs another CAT scan. And so I had to call this patient and say, hey, you need to go radiate your head again unnecessarily. And I was like, why are you forcing me to have this patient have an unnecessary CAT scan? Things like that, where I was like, for what?
That's so frustrating. And you were, even carrying the intervals. I know for me, I started in dentistry, and at our school, in dental school, patients have a wide spectrum of financial capacity to invest in their dental care, and their financial capacity and like their valuing of dentistry, like there's not you can't always tell how much someone's willing to put into the investment in their mouth. Like sometimes people who have high resources won't invest it in their mouth. So it was interesting to
Hmm.
observe. And when you had a patient who just really wanted to take care of themselves, they were going to be very responsible, and they just were put into such situation where they didn't have the resources as a kid, and it really impacted their adult dentition. To know what this, we called it the Cadillac plan, like you have treatment
Mm,
plans of multiple financial tiers, that bothered me. The fact that
yeah.
like I have to treat this patient according to their pocket size, which I know is what it's part of being in our society. I know socialized medicine also has its issues, and it's just voicing that the impact of seeing each person and wanting to give them the absolute best that you possibly can, knowing what that could potentially be. And then for me, when I did oral surgery, the hardest part for me there was if I did extractions, then they couldn't replace the tooth with anything. So I was taking away their function
Yeah.
and part of their disease process. But it was like I was taking away, and I felt I left them in my mind. There were aspects of how I left them that was worse than what I was hoping for them. And then I don't know if it was worse than where they started, because you wouldn't have intervened if that was true, but worse than I thought we could get them had there not been obstacles in the way.
Yeah. And you're bringing up all these pieces. I mean, there's like financial hardship. Like, what if I have a plan for a patient that the insurance company dictates? It's like, oh, well, they have this diagnosis, this is the treatment. But the patient says, well, it's not a problem worth solving for me because financially I'm not willing to do that.
Mhm.
Then it's just like nobody ever talks to us about that, about having these conversations with patients over, is this a problem we're solving for you? Like, how much is this going to cost? And it's half the time, most of the time, 99% of the time, we don't know. We
Yeah.
can't answer that for them.
Hmm.
They're like, well, it depends. How much is the financial hit going to be? And it's like, I don't have that information. I wish I
Yeah.
did.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's also very debilitating.
Hmm. And as people are exploring this too, I know there's multiple kind of avenues that we consider. You or had already tried some different practice models and are just seeing the way that medicine is going. So what informed your decision to leave surgery? What did that look like for you?
All of these little things, starting, I think the catalyst was September of 2023 when I talked to that ENT doctor who worked for United Healthcare, and I was like, oh my God, they've infiltrated my own specialty. Like even he has sold his soul to the devil.
Mhm.
And then that showed me that none of us are safe, that even my fellow ENT doctors can can kind of, yeah, can sell themselves. And it just underscored how big of a problem it is. And then I slowly started to pay attention and I saw with pharmaceuticals how much harder it was and like how much it taxed your mental energy to have to figure these things out, to try and split your brain. Like how do I say this for the insurance company? How do I put this in my notes so that the insurance company can understand it and approve it and not fight back? And then what is the right thing for the patient? And so all of that mental energy over those few years, or like that year and a half, I was like, this is too much. I'm so exhausted mentally from having to like split my brain in half and try to speak two languages
Mhm.
and then have to fight on the back end. And not to even mention clawbacks. I mean, then when I learned about clawbacks, I was like, oh my gosh, that's like next level.
What are clawbacks?
It's when insurance companies can take back they pay you for your service and then later on they take it back. And so one of my colleagues
This
was
is
telling
new to
me,
me.
yeah,
This is new to
and
me.
it's way more common apparently than we realize. And they do it very easily with hospitals, and hospitals don't notice because they're dealing with such big numbers. So like the insurance company will just click a button and claw back, and the hospital's like, oh, okay, we'll eat that. But when you're a small practice, like I was in a 3-person practice, and one
Mhm.
of my dermatology colleagues, who was also in the same building with me, was telling me how the worst clawback he experienced was when he was treating a patient, one of those cancer garden type patients, where they have like basal cells and squamous cells all over them. And he's treating this guy over the course of a couple of years, and they become friends. And like the guy keeps coming in, he keeps freezing off cancers, cutting out cancers. Eventually, this patient ends up with some sort of blood cancer, like a blood disorder, and he dies from it. And the dermatologist who was taking care of this man throughout those many years then gets a letter from Blue Cross and Blue Shield that says, "Hey, that patient, all those procedures you did on that patient who is now deceased, we don't think they were necessary, and so now you owe us $40,000." And so they can do this, and there's no way to fight it. There's no human to talk to. It's just they just say, hey, you didn't follow the rules that we came up with, and so now you owe us money.
I feel so absolutely sick right now. I feel like
Yeah,
I'm
it's
gonna
so
vomit.
disgusting.
I feel so nauseous right now. I cannot believe it. I cannot I cannot believe it. I had no
Yeah.
idea.
Well,
And
believe it, it's happening.
it's like I can believe it, but I wish I couldn't believe it. I was, especially in today's climate, there was a person that was predicting some things. And I'm like, I know in today's climate, we cannot predict, but we can try to protect ourselves like you have done. You say, I see where this is. I unfortunately have already felt the negative impact, and I am mind blown to even consider the threat of that. It's no even guarantee that if you fought all those hours, if you did the right thing for the patients, that that would be something that they wouldn't screw you on later, they being the
Mhm.
insurance
Yeah,
companies.
and they hold all the cards. I mean, they have all of the power. We have none. And it's not, I want to be very careful in not vilifying them,
Yeah.
okay? Because that's not useful.
Yeah.
And we let it happen. I don't know all of the details, but the HMOs of the 1980s and
Mhm.
the Affordable Care Act and all these things. But as doctors, we were all like, you know what? We'll outsource that to those people. Like we'll let them handle all the business stuff. And we just decided not to learn it.
Yeah.
And when 70% of us were independent, I think in like the 70s or 80s or 90s, and now there's only 30% of us who are independent, 70% of us are employed. We've all moved to the perpetual employed model. We're selling out to private equity. We're
Mhm.
basically saying like, "Hey, you guys figure this out for us." And they're figuring it out and they're solving for profit.
Mm. Yeah, so your shift, the narrative shift, what it sounds like to me is us taking accountability that we didn't take accountability. We do need to take accountability because when we don't, it gets in the hands of the people who have different agendas.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been complicit and not taking the time to learn our environment, to learn how the sausage is made, to learn who makes the rules, to learn every single layer of bureaucracy and then go to the very, very top and say like, hey, this isn't actually working. Because I don't think there's any executive or administrator, at least I hope there's not, who's
Mhm.
like, you know what? I want to kill people today. And I actually want to like hurt a bunch of doctors. I just don't think anybody's doing it that
Yeah.
way, but the end result is people are hurt and doctors are
Mhm.
hurt.
Mhm.
And I don't know if how many people are dying, but my guess is people are dying. And the answer is not violence. The answer is
Yeah.
not vilifying, right? The answer is to really to just kind of get everything, understand everything, and then come together to creatively solve it, to expand our headspace so we can be like, okay, what do we do? Who do we go to? Where do we start?
I think
And do
that
it collectively
your TEDx talk and what you just said really highlight this key message of listening and hearing and humanizing.
and humanizing. Yes.
And it for me, I went from full-time clinic to full-time in residency. We ended up after I left surgery because I was energetically just very depleted. My second residency, we shifted my schedule so that I became part-time clinic, part-time research. So the person in charge of finance saw that I left part-time clinic. So he was thinking of me resident as a production person, which wasn't
Mhm.
that's not necessarily the case. But because he saw the shift, he tried to reduce my salary, my resident salary, to part-time, which if that was like an academic position, maybe that would have made sense. But when I talked to HR, they're like, that doesn't make sense because as a resident, you're there to learn, you're not there to produce. And I was contributing to the research, which we're a very research heavy group. And so I didn't know I'm like, well, I can rationalize it both ways. If they're going to cut my salary, I can understand that, why that makes sense to them. And we already get really low paid. So what happened was I met with HR and then I met with the person that made that decision. And he looked at me and what he said was, I was looking at the numbers, I didn't see the person. So when we
Hmm.
could communicate, we created a solution. But that conversation really came up for me because it is just like you said, it's when we can meet the people that are making the decisions, when they can meet us and know the impact. Oftentimes, just like you shared about what brought you into surgery, like the capacity to see yourself in that role and to relate often drives us to be more invested in those types of conversations. So if people aren't really in tune or attuned to the people directly impacted, it's easier to make decisions that are very far from what's in their best interest because they are not observing the impact. But the closer we can get to the impact and observe it, you would hope that people would then understand the consequences of their actions and care enough to say, how can we work this together? So it's really increasing its benefit by reducing most of the harms that we're seeing today.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I think we have to humanize, and that would be having the executives come down and like see what's happening in between the patients and the physicians
Mhm.
and all of the caregivers, all of the nurses, the PAs, the nurse practitioners, and just get down there and see. But not many administrators or executives take the time to do that.
Mhm.
And so that's on them for sure. But then I think we have to invite them. But like you said, I mean, I think if the person who made the decision to claw back that money had been in the room with that dermatology colleague and that patient and saw what was happening, I don't think they would have made the decision
They
to
might
like
have. I think it would have to be closer to home, like a family
really.
member. I do, based off of observations. But I mean, I'd love to give people the benefit of the doubt. I worry that some hospital administrators, presidents of hospitals have been physicians. Like the president of the hospital I just left was a surgeon. I don't know him personally, actually. He could, I don't know exactly how he operates, but the institution's too big, like
Yeah.
26,000 employees or something like that. So it's siloed. So I feel that the size of the organization, I don't want to have a learned helplessness. I guess I have concerns, but my brain is often really good at seeing the concerns. And also then I have to offer, okay, what if that all works out? What would be the best case scenario as well? Like what's possible here? I do have a lot of hope, especially
I
as
know.
you're here speaking out and we're really focusing in on the relationships, the connections, and how we can support all people that have been impacted by this, which was all people like your TEDx talks, all of us are patients in some sort.
We're all going to be patients. And you're right. It does seem like too big of a problem. Like it's overwhelmingly big. And these institutions are overwhelmingly big and like corporatized medicine and all the monopolies or the monopsonies or whatever they're called. And they keep, they keep like what is it? Optum is United Healthcare, and I guess they own the bank too. I mean, it's just like cycling through. It's like a big oligopoly,
Mhm.
and it seems too big. And when you have like hospitals with thousands and thousands of employees, and the people who make the decisions aren't going to go down and like meet all those people. And as you talk about learned helplessness, like that is the exact, I think, analogy that comes up in my mind where we're kind of, as the doctors or as the physicians, the surgeons, we're like the dog, like whimpering and just taking the shock. And there is an exit. I do think there's an exit. And I think creativity will show it to us. But there has to be some discernment and some acceptance and some awareness before we can actually reach that. And I don't know if we're ever going to get there. And I think if we don't, I think the whole thing will implode and then it'll get really, really bad and it'll collapse. And then from there, we can creatively destroy it and then build it back up.
Mhm.
So I think eventually it'll be really great,
Mhm.
but it could get
And
really, really bad first.
yeah, and
But I don't know.
in
I could be wrong.
yeah, is I think there's the and. It's like the and what can we do about it? And that's kind of what I would love to explore here is kind of what it looked like in your life, how you took the agency, what it took for you, what kind of skills you developed that provided you the
Yes.
insight and the capacity to say, I'm done. What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to diversifying our identity. If we have a diverse identity and we don't attach our self-worth and our entire sense of self to one thing, being a surgeon, being a doctor, whatever it is, then we have the freedom to pivot. And it's like, okay, this identity isn't really working for me anymore. I don't love it anymore. It doesn't bring me joy. Well, I can pivot into this other thing that actually really lights me up.
Mhm.
And then when we can do that, I think if we're all doing that for ourselves, and I really believe that if we are well resourced, if the physicians or surgeons, if everybody is well resourced, if we're coming from a place of fullness, of taking care of ourselves, we're in a much better position to affect change. So I
Mhm.
don't know what that's going to look like. I mean, this year I'm spending my time resourcing surgeons, and I feel like I have an indirect impact. The more I help surgeons, the more I
Mhm.
can help them help their patients. And so I
Yeah.
do think I'm having an impact on patients. It's just not direct anymore. And I don't know what will happen for me. I mean, maybe I was thinking about politics. I don't know. I'm thinking about writing a book. I'm partnering with somebody else for like a publishing company.
Mhm.
I'm still continuing the podcast. And so I think that's how, once we have freedom of movement, we diversify our identity and we figure out other ways to have impact.
Mhm.
If we all did that, then I do think we could actually affect some meaningful change. Like if we're all shifting in one direction, you can start to say like, what's the most impactful thing I can do that will actually change this? That will, if you wanted to change the system, not to say everybody wants to, then you can identify that and then go all in with that. And you'll have the capacity to, instead of just like treading water, where you're just trying to survive and you're like, let me just see 30 patients in clinic and try to get home and not be exhausted and be present for my family. Like, how are we going to solve it when we're coming from that headspace?
Yeah, so I'm in marriage and family therapy right now as trainee master's program. For those that don't know, you may or may not know that already, but it just makes me think the way to change systems, like in marriage and family therapy, it's very systems focused, family systems, societal systems, and I think healthcare system. And often, even when it comes to, parenting or interactions with our partners, it's like you said, the word resource. When people think of it, they might just think financial resource. So I'd love to kind of talk with you more about when you think of resource, kind of what comes to mind. And also, what you are showcasing is in order to change the external systems, we need to start with ourselves.
Hmm.
And oftentimes, we've attached our value and our identity to external validation and external visions of what that looks like. And I think it might be even hard, which I think because of who you are and just the skills that you have, but I think also you're so attuned with people, like this capacity to see deeply into them to help them find themselves. Because I think once we ground and give ourselves self-compassion, it's better to see where we tolerate things that are unacceptable. And then also to have the groundedness and the self-trust to say, where do I want to be in this paradigm? what aspects do I want to contribute to, and what aspects I'm like, I see that's a problem and my priorities are here. And maybe that here means wellness for self, wellness for family unit, wellness for the local community. Like just talking out loud about how often we think of these huge agendas because of high achievers, and also at first the thing we need to do is check in with ourselves. Like, how are we first being resourced? So when you say resource, what does that mean?
Yeah, resource I think means really I having some awareness, like watching your brain, having the ability and capability to understand all different parts of yourself, because I do think it's one part of us that's like vilifying the system or vilifying whatever. It's like a protector part. And then there's another part of us, like a fear part that's like, don't leave. Like stay in this. Like we've already invested sunk cost fallacy. We went through all this like blood, sweat, and tears just to get here. We can't leave. And so we identify with that part, or we identify with the part that wants to vilify and wants to spin around in drama and identify as a victim. But I think being resource is like learning, like, oh, that's not all of me, and then really getting into who you are, the real you. And that takes some like removing some cultural narratives. And there's a lot of work, I
Mm-hmm.
think, that comes into doing that, because
Mm-hmm.
then you can take aligned action. And I do truly believe that aligned action always leads to the right place. But you can't take aligned action from like a drama part or
Yeah.
protector part
Yeah.
or a fear part. And so like everything I'm doing, like when I left my practice, I was terrified. Like I didn't do it without fear, but I was like, I thought of like my fear part was with me, and she's like freaking out. And she's like, how are we going to pay for our kids' school? How are we going to do this? Like your husband doesn't make any money. Like what are we going to do? And I'm like, I know. I hear you. Like I hear you. I know you're scared. Like come on. I'm like, but you got to trust me. Like I'm the adult. I know this is the right thing for us. We're doing this. And so you almost like split into like internal parts.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I've read No Bad Parts, and I don't know all about IFS, but
Mm-hmm.
all of that stuff like really resonates with me, and I engage with myself all the time in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I can distance myself from my fear, or I can sense when I'm like, ooh, I want to get into drama. Like I really
Yeah.
want to like
Mm-hmm.
be really mad at like United Healthcare right now. But I don't have to buy into it. And I think that's what resourcing is, because then you can start to get into like your capital S self or your essential self, your grounded self. And you're like, okay, what do I really need to do here? Okay, now let me courageously do that thing.
Yeah. I love IFS. I've just been getting more into their coursework, into understanding it. So for the people who haven't read No Bad Parts, I will link that down below too. I do think it is very interesting way to observe our thought patterns and create some space between that fear and also understand what its role is. And it has a
Yeah.
role. It's not I often just envision like what's the wound, or what's the aspect of our capital S self that it is protecting? Like what is the wounded part of that needs the healing in order to feel more whole? From my understanding of it, if people correct my terminology, but that's kind of like how I envision it too, is that fear is not the problem, right? It's just pointing you to something else that you're exploring, and your other part of yourself said, yeah, I see you, fear. Grab it by the hand, and this is the thing, this is the right thing for my family right now.
Yeah. Yeah. In the fear part, like we have a human brain. We love familiar. We love comfort. We don't like change. And so as long as we have a human brain, we're always going to have fear. And so it's like not making that weird, just normalizing that. Like obviously it's scary. We can't ever wait for it not to be scary. Like we have to take action that's aligned when we're scared. And I don't think we can take aligned action until we move out of like our left hemisphere into our right. Because like as overachievers, people pleasers, people who are tied to external validation and who have been told their entire life, like just linear growth, climb this mountain, do this thing, become this doctor, and you'll be like happy. You'll get this, whatever. You'll get power, status, and wealth. And we bought into that narrative. We've been spinning around in our left hemisphere, just like uncertainty and then in anxiety and fear. And then, certainty, what do I know? And then if we don't know, we're like, let me get anxious about it.
Mhm.
When what we really need to do is just like get into curiosity and in that don't know mind, the beginner's mind, the growth mindset, and like move into the creativity, into the right hemisphere. Like I talk about this on one of my podcasts, but I'll mention it here. Like when I was 16, I I had nowhere to live. Like I was temporarily, my small family was temporarily without a place to live. We were like, we moved away from Wisconsin, where I grew up, to Indiana with my mother's abusive, like coke addicted boyfriend. And we lived there for a year in Elkhart, Indiana. And then we moved back between my junior and senior year of high school. And we had nowhere to live. And so like my mother, my single mother, and my younger sister and I were sitting in a hotel and we're like, what do we do? And my mom's like, well, we could go live with family. And I was like, there's no way in hell I'm doing that. And in my 16-year-old child brain, who has complete access to creativity, I was like, oh, I'm not going to have a roof over my head. Well, I got to solve for that. And I called up my two best friends and I was like, Anna, can I live with you? And she's like, let me ask my mom. And I was like, Amy, can I live with you? And she's like, let me ask. And then Amy was the first one who was like, yeah. My mom says, yeah. And so I go to her house and I meet with her mother and I meet with Amy and we're sitting in her room and she's like, well, you can stay in Amy's room. Yeah, I think this will work out great. And the next morning, I like was in, it's like summer between junior and senior year of high school. And I vividly remember Amy sitting up going, hi, sister. And it was like
Oh
the
my God.
best year. But I never once was like, you awful person, to my mother, and be like, you did this to me, and like spun around in drama over it and felt like a victim, and then like sat in anxiety and was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I have nowhere to live. To me, I was a kid, so I was like, this is an adventure. Let me creatively solve this. And I
Mhm.
think like that kind of mindset is what we need to create
Yeah.
because I think we get stuck in like the left hemispheric thinking, which is
Hmm.
very dramatic and very based on what's been done before. Let's not
Hmm.
create a new thing. Like if I was like, well, 16-year-olds don't live with their friends, I can't do that, then I would be like screwed. Like what would I have done? And then it just became like solving for where do I live when I'm in college? I'm like, okay, where am I going to live in the summer? I got to figure that out. Instead of like spinning in drama, like everybody goes home and I didn't have a home to go home to, I was like, well, I got to solve for it.
Hmm.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is really fascinating. So in today I was researching like theories. So marriage and family therapy is all like grounded in theories. There's no like real like this is the way like parenting, this is the way you do it. So your response to that, there's a lot around parenting, the right way to parent. I'm not a parent, but I read a lot about parenting because I'm curious. 'Cause I'm like, I am not a parent because I there's so many contradicting theories about how you should parent that they're like literally the exact opposites.
Yeah.
And current day and time, like the you were saying about that blame, and I feel like that would be a very much in alignment with what we would do now is blame the parent because the parent should be protecting the child. The parent's also a human. I think it's going back to the humanity of this situation. Like,
Humanity. I humanized my mother.
yeah, you humanized
I was
your
like, she
mother.
didn't have the capacity to take care of me. I was like, well, I got to figure it out.
Yeah, and she is doing absolutely. And then to only, she probably felt a lot about that, about her self-judgment. And then to add to it could have just worsened her situation and self-judgment. And in one of the theories I'm reading right now is Bowen theory, and it's really focused on self-differentiation. So what I saw there is that 16-year-old, you already had the capacity to say, I have skills to take care of myself in this situation. It sounds like the best thing for the family unit and for you was to solve for that acute problem, the problem that was in front of you, because we know anxiety is like a lot about what's going to happen.
Hmm.
And Martha Beck talks a lot about how creativity is the antidote to anxiety because they can't coexist in the same time. And so you're kind of supporting the Bowen theory approach, which I've learned is really important for me. I was experiencing a reduction in anxiety when I was feeling more in tune with my own self capacity to manage whatever arises, which is what I heard you just do, is you could
Yeah.
develop the self-trust. And people, I think, often confuse confidence with, I did, so I speak for myself. I often confused being confident with knowing it all. You had to know it all. And then
Yeah.
I realized that's not possible. And now I kind of feel like, okay, can love to learn things, but also I think where I develop more confidence is in the self-trust and in the community and having the capacity to solve for whatever arises, which you just captured really well. What do you think about confidence and where it comes from?
Yeah, no, I think it is self-trust. It is, and that is exactly where it comes from. And I think I developed that really young, and then I just kept taking action from there. And it has served me really well throughout my life. Like even this house that I live in, like we bought it. I somehow convinced my husband, I'm not a confident house buyer. I've never bought a house before. I've never lived in a house before. That was my own. I've lived in other people's homes. But when we bought this house, like my first house that I get to own, we went in, it was like the open house. And I was like, this is our house. The only one we looked at. And we just like put in an offer over asking.
Wow.
And and so I would look like a confident buyer, right? But it was just like I was like, this is it. And it
Yeah.
was the best financial investment we ever made. But if you looked back at that time and you're like, am I a good financial investor? No, I would never identify as that.
Uh-huh.
But I guess you could say that was a confident financial investment that I made.
How did you know that it was your house?
The I knew the town was our town. And then the kitchen, just like I was like, this is our kitchen. And I could see myself just like cooking there, and it was the perfect neighborhood, and it was everything I envisioned. And it just felt right. I was like, we need to live here.
Mhm. It's so beautiful. And I think you were talking about just like our left brain would hijack that and be like, no,
Yeah. The
right?
left might be like, well, we have to look at 30 houses and then we have
No.
to like go through and like make sure. And I love my husband for him like entertaining my anti-culture approach where I'm like, no, we're not going to look at any more. We're just going to buy this one.
That's
And he's like, okay.
amazing. That is really awesome. I love that. And it feels like having that decision prepared you well for the big decision. Well, I'm putting a label on it big as it felt big to me when I left surgery. I'm anticipating it felt big to
It
you.
felt huge.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay. I'm like, okay, that was a values, but I anticipate and even like the identity thing. So this surgeon identity, how does it impact you right now?
Yeah. I've kind of let her go. I don't know if I'll go back to her. I might. I'm not attached. I'll have to want to do it. It'll have to come from a deep desire. I used to have a deep desire, now I don't.
Yeah, and Amy Vertrees offered like once a surgeon, always a surgeon. Like you have the capacity to help so many surgeons. You are a surgeon. So I think,
Yeah.
we both kind of the way that you responded, I think we were both kind of thinking, practicing and like how does it impact you in your day to day if you're not doing what we could have once defined as a surgeon in our own mind. Um, and it doesn't take away from the fact that you are a surgeon and all the surgeries you've already done and the capacity to then be there in the mindset of the other surgeons who are toying with the impact of their own moral injury and what it feels like. And I think even extending that to all humans who have been impacted by this deep sense of moral injury or the experiences that you have gone through, it's really focusing in on the granularity of those life lessons,
Yeah.
and even like the identity thing, because our culture creates performance-based identities, which are very title focused. And if we can deconstruct what it meant for you to be a surgeon from like a values aligned place, what aspects of those values do you feel are still true to what you're doing today?
From a values aligned place. Well, there was a point where I was like completely identified as a surgeon. That was the only thing I identified as. And if you took that away, I was completely worthless. I felt worthless. And that's where coaching came in and helped me build up that other identity. And I don't know where that came from. It could be childhood, it could be training, it could be all of the above.
Mhm.
But I 100% overattached my self-worth to that identity. And it took a detaching. And then once I detached, I was like, well, we're all free to evolve.
Mhm.
It's just we're always evolving and changing. And who's to say that once you identify as one thing, you're supposed to identify that as that for the rest of your life? Just because you decided it when you were 16 years old and saw your own hand surgery or whatever it is, wherever that moment was where we decided we were going into surgery, and then somebody said, well, as long as you do that, then you will be successful. You'll have financial freedom, and that is what success is. And so you have to do that. And that is how you have an impact on the world, and that is how you
Mhm.
make your life meaningful. And then when you decide, okay, well, actually, that doesn't feel true anymore. I can have an impact any way I want to, and I can create money with my value that comes from my brain. And as surgeons, it comes from our hands. And so we can apply that anywhere,
Mhm.
whenever we want to, but I can create value for other humans in a through a different avenue. And if my evolution of self is telling me that I no longer want to create value this way through this identity, then I'll create it through this other identity, through like my coaching identity or
Mhm.
potentially becoming an author identity and things like that. It's like, or maybe changing systems. Who knows? And
Yeah.
who's to say that it shouldn't evolve that way?
Mhm. Yeah,
Like maybe that's natural.
I'm even exploring like the wording of what I just offered you because it sounds like me maybe even the invitation to hold on to aspects of the surgery identity would negatively impact. Like there's a capacity that when you said you her go, and then I introduced the what if she's always here, and that's like, oh, actually, is that potentially could that actually be more harmful and keep people trapped if that's not how they choose to perceive it at their life right now?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly. Like I could live the rest of my life never operating again and I would
Yeah.
be completely fine.
Mhm.
Or I could go back.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, well, I mean, again, that's another values, but I've had to contemplate a lot of these similar things about procedural and just this question of, am I ready to completely walk away from my dental license? And I think that where you just landed, I could take it or leave it, is the healthy
Mhm.
way for me to decide that whatever I do is fine because I thought parts of me wanted to leave it early as an avoidance strategy to block myself from not exploring the deeper meaning that I have attached to it.
Hmm.
And by maintaining it until I get to that point of I can take it or leave it, I have no attachment. That's kind of the point where I'm like, now I can go. And I say that because a lot of times I think people come and they feel maybe they should leave clinical medicine, and then it's the fear that's keeping them there. I think it's so complex, and to tease apart that time frame for each individual and what's right. And then also, like you said, this is the right decision, right? This is a decision that feels appropriate right now. Take
Yeah.
it, leave it. Like
Yeah,
always living in
exactly.
in the now as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean I worry that people will leave out of escapism
Yeah.
where it's like this is untenable, I can't do this anymore. And then they have like the grass is greener theory.
Hmm.
But I would love for people not to leave from that because I do think that's a smaller like headspace. It's more of reduced cognitive capacity and I just don't that's not aligned action basically. It's trying to run away.
Yep, I can tell from experience and from observation that that's true. So for the people that are hearing it, that are in that mindset, I know you are a coach. I know it's been helpful for me. What would it look like to support themselves and to get the support they need to slow down and to ground themselves in order to make a more aligned action?
Yeah, I think it's learning to be okay where you are. And I do think that takes a mindset shift. And it requires dropping the drama, like recognizing where you identify as a victim and who are the villains that you've imagined in your head. And then, really getting back into your business where you're like, okay, am I thinking about what everybody else is thinking of me? Okay, well, I have no agency there. Let me just think about what I think of me, my opinion of me. What do I have control? Where's my control? Am I thinking about the healthcare system that's broken and expensive and I don't have any control there? And it just became that. It just is. We can't deny it. It exists. And am I gonna like rail against reality and like shake my fist and be angry about it? Or am I gonna just get back to where I can make one tiny little step forward? And then once you're like, okay, I don't have drama. I'm not vilifying. I don't identify as a victim, and I'm back in my business. I know where my control is. And then you're like, okay, well, what am I trying to do? How do I want to have impact? What's like my big why? Then I think you can start to know what your aligned action is. I think you have to do all of that, and that takes work because we're all okay where we are.
Hmm.
It's like we're not being mauled by bears. Our brain is telling us like we're in all of this fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop because of the imagined scenarios in our head. I mean, that's what anxiety is. It's like the fear response in real time to a story in our head. And so we have to change those stories. It's like, yeah, you're exhausted because you're working really, really hard. You're doing all these cases or whatever it is if you're a surgeon or you're an employed physician and your employer requires you to see everybody every 10, 15 minutes and you don't think it's enough and you hate clinic and you leave and you're exhausted, but you're okay. Like it's not it doesn't have to kill you if you don't let it. And so you have to take the time and the effort to get okay. And
Mhm.
then I think once we're okay where we are, then we can start to kind of listen to that whisper, like that internal voice. It opens up like a space, right?
Yeah. And if their circumstances are such that they can't, like for me, it took taking an FMLA, taking like
Yeah.
there are some environments where it's like you might need to take a step in order to get clear, creating space from that environment. I know for me, hindsight bias, I'm like, oh, I kept trying to coach myself to go back into surgery when I was taking my FMLAs. And I didn't have the clarity to really think about what I wanted until I gave myself permission to rest, which was so many years after. Like, I think I'm in that space now in 2025. Like, I feel like I'm finally allowing because when you said clawback with insurance, I kind of felt that from a different context of like holding on to all of like that past and like afraid to let it go because the future is so unknown. And like I just changed the vision in my head, say like I know what I don't want. Let's get grounded what I do want, but then also the vision, if I look at it like a white canvas and I have all these beautiful vibrant paint colors, it's not as bleak as that dark hole of despair that I was
Hmm.
offering. And when we are not resourced for our basic needs standpoint, we are in like our bodies are going to think we're in a deep threat that like meeting our basic needs. So I think what you offered there, it's kind of a great capture of our full discussion. And I was curious about what you would like the audience to take away from our time together.
That what you want matters and that who you are matters. And it's worth it. It's worthy work. And if you have to take time to do it, to to shed some of the cultural narratives and to shed some of the shoulds that you've been giving yourself and to shed the external validation or the attachment to it and to kind of really engage and identify the person underneath all of that, the human, the very worthy human being underneath all of that, and really get to know that person and develop that relationship and make that relationship a priority, then I think you can start to open up all the possibilities. You won't feel so much like a cornered animal. You'll start to see, oh my gosh, like I have all of these options. So that would be, I think, my parting advice.
Yes, the exploration, you have so many options. And if you don't see them, I would think the first thing you need to do is rest.
Rest.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And where can they connect with you to figure out how to work with you and also explore your podcast and all the amazing posts that you have on social media?
You can find me on Instagram at the_surgeon_coach or melthackercoaching.com. Or you can find me wherever your podcast, Surgeons with Purpose is the name of the podcast.
Beautiful. I think you exemplify that very well.
Thank you.
Yeah. And for the audience, if you have any questions, reflections, insights that you want to share, please drop them in the comments. We love to hear from you. And until next time, thanks for being here.